we're happy to present this session on management and preparedness. As you all know, we worked with the Department of Ed this year on topics for our second year superintendents, and this is one that they suggested for us. Of course, we already knew we needed a session like this, but they reinforced that. And most of you have met Shelley, our presenter Shelley and Lori, in some form or another. Lori did a session last year with you all on I think Communication 101 and crisis management might have been part of that, but this is going to delve deeper into that. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lori Mueller, who you know from the Donovan Group, and Shelley Evers she's a supervisor at the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety and Crisis Management, and I'm going to let them get started.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Amy. Yes, Lori and I are happy to present to you today about definitely an important topic. And of course, you all are at different levels in your crisis planning, of course. And so at a time when we all look at Google and Yelp reviews to determine where we're going to have dinner, it seemed appropriate to look at our crisis planning that way with a little tongue in cheek and say, what would a Google review say about your current crisis plans? Are you a 5 out of 5? Do you have all your boxes checked? Are you more like a 3 out of 5 and you kind of have some work to do? I will tell you, a couple years ago, the Center for School and Campus Safety had some work to do on our model crisis plan, and that is legislatively mandated. And we took a look at it and it was very outdated. It would have been a 3.5 out of 5 at best. So we did the work, we backed up. It was a significant amount of work. We did it, and now we hope it's at least a 4.9 out of 5. So as we go along, think about whether there are some nuggets that Lori and I are going to share that might be helpful to you in getting your crisis plans to a 5 out of 5. So the big thing that we all need to know is there's lots of templates, and I've dropped a couple things into the chat for you all, the legislative summary for schools, and a link to look at some of our resources and take advantage of those. But a template's not a one size fit all. And why is that? You know, you can answer in the chat or you can just ponder some of these questions as we go along. But one of the big things is our staff and student populations are unique from one end of the Commonwealth to the other. Our potential hazards might be unique. And so looking at all of this and knowing that it's a big undertaking to have 5 out of 5 crisis plans, is there a magic formula? So I would say if there was one, it would be to look at all of this beforehand, before the emergency. Look at all 3 phases that we're going to talk about, the before, during, and after, before the crisis. And the other part of that magic formula is relationships. Your school climate can mitigate a whole lot of things. And so if you have a positive school climate, staff and students feel safe there, they feel a part of something. I think that's huge. Relationships with others, relationships with us at the center, relationship with Lori's group, relationships with VAS, etc. So relationships and some pre-planning is going to get you a long way towards that magic formula. So again, we're going to look at this in a before, during, and after phase process. And again, even though some of this is during and after, thinking about it all ahead of time is really, really critical. So take a look at these actions that are kind of laid out in a before, during, and after way, and then look at what might be all the way across, what's in each one of these phases. So of course, the before, you have to lay the ground work with legislation, and you look at your climate and any internal things you can do, external things to your buildings, etc. Who should you involve in planning? Who are you required to involve in planning, etc. You have your school safety audit, and that's 5 parts. That's lots of good stuff. Taking advantage of training and resources, etc. Then communicating. And then likewise in the during and after phase, you're going to implement those plans and activate your plans. You're going to use plain language, etc., communicate, etc. And then after, you're going to get back to the business of work in school as quickly as possible. So what did each one of those phases have in common? What was important in each one of those? What was on the list?
We're going to exercise good wait time here.
Do you want them to come off mute?
You can definitely come off mute. Yes, yes. Or put it in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with. There could be more than one right answer, but there's definitely one we're looking for. Right, Lori?
Mm-hmm. Let me give you a little hint.
All right. So we're going to go into the before, and I'm going to let you know that communication was that critical piece in all of the phases. And so that's where Lori comes in.
I'm in communications. Yes. So
So before we jump into that though, and I've kind of alluded to it, but what does the gift of thinking about all this before a crisis give you and others? And there's a couple things it gives you.
I think it gives you an opportunity to engage others in those conversations, which creates awareness that you'll want if you ever get to the dooring phase.
That's critical. And I say this later on, and you're kind of alluding to it though. The big rule of thumb is don't wait till the emergency to meet your emergency responders and your partners. So introducing yourself ahead of time, that's critical. And it gives you the gift of time. In an actual emergency, fear, stress, time, media scrutiny, potential harm or loss of life, all of those things are going to be, your mind is going to be speeding up. So thinking about this now lets you lay some plans into place, and then the during and the after phases are going to go so much better. So the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety, it's actually our 25th birthday this year. We were established in code in 2000 after Columbine. And so we are legislatively mandated to do certain things. In fact, all these things here, there's some specifics to it too. But for the purpose of this, I think this is good enough. And again, the legislative summary is in the chat for you to have kind of those things at your fingertips. But basically, we are required to do it, but we love it. My colleagues and I are at your service. We are here to help you. We never want to be a gotcha. We want to be that resource for you to, ask us for what you need. If we don't have it, we're going to help you get it. So likewise, there's some legislative mandates for K-12 schools. And these are the topics by and large that those are centered around. Again, your legislative summary that I dropped in the chat is going to lay out each one of those, and it has links to the code so that you can go to it and see exactly what the code says. And I will say, we can't, although we're never going to be a gotcha, we definitely cannot override legislation, and nor would we try to do that. But a lot of what we suggest as resources, we have vetted those. We think those are best practices. We want to give you the very best tools to choose from. So there are lots of places where it's up to you how you do these things. And that's where we come in. We want to give you the best tools and resources, just like Lori and her team wants to give you the best communication tools to use. All right. What kind of communication things do we need to think about in advance of a crisis?
yeah, so we come from the lens that communication helps us continue to sustain trust with all of our targeted audiences. And so when we think about crises, this is a really important component of the work of a superintendent and their leadership. So in advance of a crisis, a couple of things that we encourage our school districts and school divisions to think about is making sure that you have, and in your case in Virginia, it's called an emergency management plan, or in some states, it's called an emergency operations plan. This is your plan that gives you really good guidance on what steps to take when there is a crisis. And it's a communication tool for you and your team, as well as making sure that you have that tool shared between law enforcement and emergency management so that you all are on that same communication channel for how do we operate during a crisis. And usually part of that plan is a crisis communications plan. And a lot of times in our work, we find that school systems don't have a crisis communications plan. What that consists of is usually it includes all of the key contacts that you want to make sure you're communicating with during a crisis. This way you don't have to look up their emails or phone numbers during that time, and it's shared with your leadership. It lists out the roles and responsibilities to show the capacity or how you maybe even run incident command. And then also the big piece of this plan is just having a set of templates, already created communications for different types of crises that could occur, so that when that happens, you don't have to spend the time trying to craft, the most logical and coherent crisis communication, because in that moment, you're in that fight, flight, or freeze mindset, and it's just really challenging. Next slide, Shelley. And so some other things to consider in being prepared is this notion of a safety strategic planning. As school divisions, you're very familiar with strategic planning, but what about the idea of considering a process where you just strategic plan around safety and security? This is a way to create deeper community engagement and trust in your community. And maybe this allows you to set up an ongoing task force to monitor the work that you're doing around safety and allows you to provide those results to your community, as well as just keep that focus on continuous improvement. So, I know that Shelley's team has a lot of great resources to kind of assess the scene of what's working and maybe what's not, or what you might have in place or not. That's a great basis to start the strategic planning, and doing so again with all of your community. Encourage school divisions to keep a clear line of communications and continue to collaborate with local law enforcement and emergency management. I think it's an important tip to try to co-plan and meet with these individuals in your respective areas on a regular basis. There's a lot of promise in conducting trainings and practices or drills in collaboration, and as well as sharing important information. Do you share your school division's calendar with your local law enforcement and emergency management so that they're aware of certain days that may be atypical in your calendar that could maybe support responding to a crisis in the future? Next slide. Some other things to consider in preparation is just building signage. Here's an example on the right-hand side. Here are some signs that we created for a school system in the greater Chicago area. They came to us saying we really struggle when we put our building into a hold or a lockdown, and we have people approaching the building and they can't get in and they don't know what's going on. So we just created these simple slide in signs that they can put on their doors, as well as making sure throughout your buildings that you display your protocols for responding to crises as a communication tool. And are your windows and doors marked on the outside with signage to help responders in the event there's something truly significant occurring in your building? Before a crisis happens, we think there's a lot of promise in informing our families and staff when there is a crisis, where can you go to get the best information? So whether that's, social media, your website, or your student information system, again, before anything happens, say there's going to be days, right? There are going to be days that we're going to have a crisis. So please look for the most accurate and current information here. Also, with your capacity building at your team level, there's a great opportunity here to create muscle memory for how to respond with communications by doing tabletop activities. A strategy I used as a superintendent is when a headline would appear about a crisis someplace, maybe it was just merely embarrassing or maybe truly tragic, we would just take 5 minutes as a team and talk about, what if that happened here? How would we communicate? How would we respond? Again, that builds great muscle memory so that they know on your team how you would want them to proceed. And then here to make sure you spend time being intentional and developing relationships with your local media. See if you can develop a relationship with a friendly, we like to call them, those individuals that you can be first responding to and sharing information in the event of a crisis. And you know that they're going to make sure that that information is accurate. If you have this capacity, I think this crosses over into like merging communications with safety measures to have in place. But if you have capacity to have someone to monitor social media in your community, particularly social media related to your school system and their communications, the idea here is that we're looking for digital leakage, anything that could signal that there might be a crisis impending. Make sure that that individual or team is able to inform those at the sites to conduct threat assessments, that this is information that you're seeing. And along with that, just creating a see something, say something culture with your families, your staff, and your students. And one of the things Shelley and I talked about recently is that this notion of see something, say something is almost starting to become too cliche for people, and they're not really thinking when they hear that what that truly means. So maybe, creating that culture using language that expresses the same thing, but maybe doesn't lean into that expression. Then I always ask my superintendents, do you have a public information officer? And, the PIO is part of Incident Command System. So do you have one? It's important that you do. Have you told your community who that person is? Maybe it's you as the superintendent. Is that person trained in incident command? And there's a link here to the FEMA basic training for that. I used to participate with our local law enforcement when they were trained in this particular area, and so that we were able to collaborate on that training, as well as a tool that you could do right now is put a tool in your cloud in your system that's a key facts document, so that when a crisis comes forward, everybody on your response team can go to that key facts document to enter in information so everybody's using the same information. And then if you have to do a press conference, we also suggest that you do a conference jointly with law enforcement. And in advance of that, that you create a media advisory as a communication. And this media advisory does things like telling you, all your media outlets, where they can station themselves, where they can find the most up-to-date information. We like to try to keep them off the perimeter of whatever may be happening. And you want to, in advance of that press conference, tee up some sound bites. What are the key messages that you need to get out? Think about what kind of questions might be coming and maybe even practice your responses. And most importantly, and we've learned this through our partnership with Safe and Sound Schools, it's really important that your PIO is a person who has the ability to demonstrate compassion and strength at the same time if they're dealing with something that's pretty serious.
That's great information. And so before I go into my next slides about the other considerations for before the crisis, speaking of the See Something, Say Something, Virginia's K-12 threat assessment program, public service announcements are surrounded around, and we also have a website, OK to Speak Out. And so what we're trying to encourage is for that whole mentality of I'm going to get somebody in trouble, or I don't want to be a snitch or whatever, that really you are helping someone, a friend or whoever. And so the OK to Speak Out is just a really a good term we think that's going to resonate. We've been using it for a little bit now. We also have No Talk Ask as a part of our suicide prevention campaign. Likewise, we had public service announcements and a website for those. So there's 4 different required types of drills in Virginia. So obviously the pre-planning, the before section of that is to fully participate and encourage your staff and your team and your schools to fully participate. And in fact, perhaps even ask law enforcement to come and observe your drills and let them let you know, is this the best way to do this? If we had to evacuate a different way, what would we do? What should we do? And kind of build those relationships ahead of time. It's a great way to strengthen your school law enforcement partnership. And of course, develop a tone for safety in your school, in your division. So another thing that's really good to do ahead of time, other than the fact that it's required, these components of the annual school safety audit, either you all are responsible for it or you have a designee who's taking care of these things for you. But one of those big things is the crisis plan certification. So we know that everybody has a crisis plan, and because you certify to us every year, we have 100% compliance. But your tool for planning here is to look at these other pieces in conjunction with it. Your school safety inspection checklist, that walkthrough checklist. What does the physical parts of these buildings look like? Is lighting needed, et cetera? So not only does it kind of give you a big picture of school safety, look at your climate survey, et cetera. There's a secondary school climate survey every year. In fact, that's going on right now. So all of these different parts and pieces all put together, also with your SBAR data, also with any other data that you have, gives you a big picture to know what do we need to take to the board as far as improvements, lighting in a parking lot, for example, or access control, et cetera. So you look holistically at your whole division, but it also lets you know, where do we need to focus? And in fact, there is, for the climate survey and all these things, there is a statewide survey. So you can look at how your division stacks up against the different areas of the Commonwealth, and as far as is bullying an issue, if someone brought a weapon to school, would someone report that, et cetera. And so all of that is just really, really good information to take a look at ahead of the crisis. So, what is the most probable problem or crisis that can occur at a school? What do you think that is? What comes to mind when you think of the most likely thing that can happen? You can come off mute, or you can put it in the chat, or you can just think about it, whatever you like.
And I know you're all on a shy group, so
Yeah, that's all right. So here's some examples of things that can happen. So obviously today, for people who don't have power, they're going to say severe weather is the most likely. So according to the school safety audit survey, a medical emergency is the most likely. That is the most common reason people actually activate their plans. So, but what do people worry or talk about or think about the most? An active attack, right? So even though medical emergencies, weather-related emergencies, some of these other things, a fight in a school, are more likely to happen, we do know that people worry about these things. And we do know that, school climate is so very important. So a mechanism to allow people to either voice their concerns or plan for those or conduct a training that shows that, yeah, we're thinking about this. We want you to feel safe. And so, of course, schools are mandated to have aberrant behavior training every year and recognition of that. So as a part of that, it's kind of, one extreme to the other. One thing is likely, one thing is not. But certainly if something like that were to occur, the impact of it is so significant, and worrying about people do feel safe. So along with that goes all hazards planning. So yes, you plan for the most likely things to happen, but you do look at all the possible things and how you can mitigate each of those. So your crisis planning team has to, by legislation, consist of these groups of people. So they actually have to be at the planning table, looking at developing your plans. And so what's nice about that, as we alluded to a little bit ago, is that it gives you that opportunity to meet people ahead of the crisis and not wait till the crisis. So it also just makes sure that there's lots of different eyes looking at these plans for various different reasons and different components. So instead of operating in the silo, these different people and groups are looking at it to determine exactly what is the best plan for your locality. So we talked about drills a little bit, but who's going to do what in a crisis? Lori alluded to that with the incident command, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later on. But what emergency supplies do you have? Would you need, etc.? Does anyone need an individual safety plan, either because of an ongoing medical issue or something? Did someone break their leg and they're going to need that, just for a short time? And how would you address any medical emergencies during a crisis? And of course, individuals with additional needs, you want to consider that ahead of time as well. So here's some list of available resources that we have, templates. I'm not going to go through all these, but some of that's available in the link I already gave you, and some of it, is just as available on our website, and I'm happy to send it to you after. But one of the big things is free training. We have so much available, and it's available in Benchmark, which is pre-recorded on-demand lessons. They're also virtual things such as what we're doing today, in-person things. We'd love to have you host an in-person session. So basically, we're going to meet you where you are and give you the training and resources that you need based on where you are with your planning. So the individual safety plan, just to talk a little bit about that, it was developed by Safe and Sound Schools. Michelle Gay's daughter, Josephine, was killed at Sandy Hook, and they developed Especially Safe, and we contracted with them to develop a special needs guide for Virginia. And so an individual safety plan is much like when you talk about an individual education plan. And so it doesn't have, one doesn't have to be, you don't have to have both. You can have an individual safety plan for whomever needs it. And so that middle piece is kind of the main part that I wanted to convey, is this team's concept of transportation, mobility in an emergency, any emotional, behavioral, mental health things that would need to be considered in an emergency, any communication factors that would be in play in an emergency, any medical needs that would need to be addressed, and any security and supervision needs that would need to take place. So again, all the forms and all the different communication things that you need for development of that is available in our tools. Happy to have you use it for free, as is appropriate for you and your team. So moving on to the during section. So obviously when during happens, there's no more planning. It is executing the plan. And so Lori, start us off with communication considerations
Yeah,
during.
absolutely. So again, if you are finding yourself in a crisis where you may have to do any type of crisis communication, and again, this could be just embarrassing, like a student did something embarrassing and it's something you have to address, or it could be something truly tragic. Sometimes there's a lot of promise in being able to doing joint communications. A lot of times with the crisis communications that we provide you all, we ask you at times, can your chief of police also be a joint signer on this letter or message? So think about the promise of that. Determine where information is going to be posted during a crisis and shut down other communications. This is really important for something that's happening truly tragic. We've seen with the Uvalde situation that if there are communications going out on too many different platforms, because of algorithms, sometimes the most recent information is not getting out to everybody, and that just creates a lot of confusion, and it can create a lot of trauma for those who are most impacted. Also, it's important to just determine where all your information is going to be posted that's most accurate and timely, and share that with your media outlets so that they're not becoming interference while you're trying to manage something that is transpiring. Next slide. Also, during a crisis, we think it's important to just have this little conversation about social media. It is the quickest way to get information out, but again, it's not the most optimal piece of information to get out or optimal tool because of the fact that there's an algorithm. So not everybody is going to see your message if you just use social media. We think it has to be a part of your communication toolkit, but in a really significant crisis, it's important we use other tools. Like your student information system is probably the best one. When you are posting information on social media, because it is so fast, we want to give you that guidance of making sure that you verify your facts before you share them with at least two different sources. And also making sure that we don't get in advance of law enforcement by sharing information that's too sensitive. Maybe it's sensitive to their investigation. So again, the value of having that collaboration is important. We also find that superintendents will want to have all of the information before they do any kind of communication. And this can be very problematic because everybody else has access to social media too, including your students. So we don't want you to fall behind and let that narrative be created for you. We think it's important to communicate right away once you hear something, and that can be just really a holding statement. And you see that example here with morsels of information. Maybe you can say, if it's verified, students are safe, police are investigating, and we'll share more information shortly. And we have found a lot of promise in saying to our audiences, we're aware that something is transpiring, we're on top of it, and we're going to communicate in the next 5 minutes more information. That way, you're teaching and informing your audiences that you're the source that is going to get the most accurate information, and it helps to mitigate others creating that narrative for you. We also get that question often, well, how frequently should we be sharing information or releasing new information or with social media, posting information? And we think the earlier we are in an incident, the less time there is between each post or each share. But as we work through a process of responding to a crisis, then we can spread out that time. And again, it's important to share, we're going to come back in 15 minutes with some more information. And it's important to keep sharing information as we get new information. It's also a good idea to have someone on your team that's assigned the role to monitor social media during a crisis and respond to any misinformation that starts to get some traction, as well as maybe report information that's being shared on social media that could be of potential interest in resolving whatever incident is occurring in your schools. Next slide. I can't go through this slide deck without adding in a slide about two-way radios because they are everywhere in our schools. And it's a super important communication tool during a crisis. One thing that we find is that a lot of our staff aren't properly trained in how to use their radios. And there's again a promise here to work with your local law enforcement and train together in how you would use your two-way radios during a crisis. And also just having a specific channel that's identified for use during a crisis so that you can have all your crisis information on one chatter instead of having everything being shared. Also, during a crisis, and this is Communications 101, we've talked about this in the past. Don't forget to communicate internally first because your internal staff, they're doing the same things. They're picking up their cell phones, they're communicating out. So make sure that they're informed as early as possible. And even if it's just like when you have to inform everybody that they're included, right? Make sure that, again, you immediately correct false information that might be shared from staff. Think about also translating communications. Think about this from a culturally sensitive lens. Uh, do your native speakers and your English learners, are they getting access to the same communications? And that's a good test for yourselves. So think about that. Make sure that you maybe have this as part of your crisis communications plan checklist, that we translate all of these communications to these certain languages and you have those people ready to go. Alert also when the communication, sorry, I can't talk. Alert through communications that a threat is over. We find that often when we're going through a crisis, we're just so relieved when the crisis is over that all of a sudden we forget we should let everybody else know that the crisis is over. So don't forget to communicate when the threat is over. Dealing with the media during this time. So one thing we've learned from Safe and Sound Schools, and every single time I attend one of their conferences or events, I learn something new. And so this is a old superintendent listening to the experiences of those who really have been impacted by significant trauma and learning the important role that the superintendent or the PIO has for school systems during a crisis. We learned during the Sandy Hook situation that for whatever reason, the superintendent was not capable of getting up in front of cameras and demonstrating compassion and strength. And because of that, the media went to the families to get information. And you can just imagine how horrific that was. And so, saying this to you now to be thinking about, again, who is that right person on your team who can serve in that capacity? They have to be the spokesperson because it's our responsibility to protect those who are being most affected. We're going to be asked questions from the media, and I think it's really important to not evade those questions and answer them. If we don't have the answer, being really forthright about we don't have that information right now, but we'll work to get it to you as soon as we can. Also, direct the media where to find accurate information and up-to-date information. Maybe this is on your website. One of the things that we've done in the past is we've created a media spreadsheet for districts as media keeps calling in and asking questions. We actually will set up a voice messaging system where messaging system will share out what we can about a crisis. The media is able to grab that and then ask the media person to leave their contact information with the instructions that will add them to our spreadsheet and make sure that we send any additional communications their way so they don't have to keep calling. That is just too much to manage during a crisis. And then lastly, avoid interviews while information is still evolving. Again, this is something we learned during the Uvalde. We had people stand up and talk to cameras and assure everyone that students were safe when the whole situation was still evolving. So we really want to avoid doing any kind of interviews until a threat is over. Reunification, I know Shelley's going to talk about this, and I'm so grateful for that because it's so important. And this is where schools get beat up from not communicating enough about. And holding students too long in terms of reunifying them with families. So the shorter we can make this process, the less long-lasting trauma that this is going to offer to families. So during a crisis, it's really important if you're evacuating students to communicate as soon as possible what the perimeter is of the site that you want everybody to stay away from, and pick a site for reunification that's far away enough so that we can keep our families safe who want to get access to their kids. This is going to allow our first responders more opportunity to be efficient with their response. We also can do this in advance by telling our staff and families when we have to reunify, here's what you should expect. You need to have this kind of documentation with you. It's great if you can practice reunification with your staff because that'll make them more quick with their response. And also think about like having a go bag or a toolkit ready to go with the signage that you might need and all of the the paper materials that are going to be needed to connect families with their children.
I am going to hit on that here in just a few slides down, but I did want to say there's an opportunity at the summer conference as a pre-conference to participate in a reunification exercise. And we are also doing 3 full-scale reunification exercises across the Commonwealth with I Love You Guys this year. So we hear that if there is a weak link with schools and divisions, then reunification, it just hasn't been practiced, hasn't been thought about as much. All of our in-person trainings have the standard reunification method, standard response protocol in it. They have exercises peppered through them. And so also this Narrowing the Gap webinar series that's going to start in March. All of it has it. We're trying to deliver it in lots of different ways for schools and divisions. So please take advantage of that to the degree that you can. So again, during the during phase, you don't want to pull out a big giant manual and say, how are we going to respond to this? You want some simple, easy to follow instructions for a quick and coordinated response. So as a state level in 2021, and are now facilitating a voluntary adoption by divisions and schools of the SRP and SRM. And that is through the I Love You Guys. So what our school safety audit survey told us in 2024 was all but 3 divisions in Virginia were either already using SRP and SRM or had planned to do it. So that's one of the reasons that we are just flooding all of our trainings and information with this so that schools and divisions can get stronger in their use of these practices because they really are good. Before we talk about those actions, we'll talk about a little bit about the incident command. Lori talked about it earlier. It is really, really important to have clearly who's going to do what in an emergency. So essentially there's 4 different sections underneath the incident commander. Operation does stuff, planning plans stuff, logistics gets stuff, and finance pays for stuff. So most of what needs to happen in an emergency can fall under those fairly easily. And I'm sure you can, have in your mind who might be doing some of these things at a division or at an individual school level. But basically, it can expand and contract as it needs to. So if only an incident commander is needed and you don't even technically establish incident command, that's all you need to do. But in a bigger incident, a more long-term, bigger scale incident, you do want to hand off some of those tasks because research will tell us that as human beings, we can manage 3 to 7 things without starting to lose a grip on them. And that's called span of control. And so, when you start having to bring in transportation and bus drivers and things like that, and if you have to feed, bills are going to come in for different things if you've had to purchase emergency equipment and things like that. And of course, your operations person is going to make sure it all happens and report back to the incident commander. So all of those parts and pieces, there are tools and tips for school incident command. This graphic adds the public information officer piece, which is absolutely critical, and then a liaison between first responders, et cetera. Each division is required to have an emergency manager, and so that liaison officer could also be a safety officer. You can have a person with multiple roles as long as they don't get above that 3 to 7 span of control piece. This is an example of what school incident or building incident command might look like. And, we can provide this to you, so don't feel like you have to memorize it or anything. But basically, it just shows that somebody's doing each thing here, and it's clearly defined. So what that also prevents is one person or two people doing exactly the same thing and wasting efforts, because that is even more detrimental, because in an emergency, you don't have a lot of extra time. So each person doing what they know they're supposed to do gets everything done versus two, three people doing exactly the same thing, and then most things aren't getting done. So it essentially needs to be the most qualified person on the scene. And sometimes that does mimic your everyday role, and sometimes it doesn't. If there are two people in a room and one of them is a higher rank, per se, based on their everyday title, a superintendent or principal, for example, but the principal is the one that knows CPR and someone needs CPR. Obviously, we need the person who knows CPR to do it. So that's kind of just as clear an example as I can give. But just the most qualified person. If someone is, tasked with speaking on an intercom, but they get into hysterics when they do that, that's not your person who's going to be your PIO. So most qualified. These are the SRP 5 actions. They are not meant to replace your crisis plan. They're meant to overlay your crisis plan. Again, is it safe to stay in the building, or do we need to leave the building? And these are the 5 actions that are determined. And again, anybody with these 5 things should be able to determine what it is that needs to happen. A substitute, someone who goes from school to school, etc. So that's why we recommend no codes and this plain language. So moving to the after section. Lori, tell us about what needs to happen communication-wise in after.
All right. So one thing to think about is to debrief with your team. What worked during your response with communications, what maybe could have been improved, and take note of this, right? And determine, are there any services that we should be communicating out to our families, staff, students at this time, or any resources that we want to make sure they have access to? So again, the crisis is over, but the communications is not or are not. And so thinking about what can we do better, take that time to debrief, and then also focus on the impact that what the crisis may have had on those and work to heal, right? So maybe our crisis communications at this point is conducting a post-crisis campaign. And a campaign usually includes things like social media, news release, follow-up messages through your student information system. But it's like maybe, just acknowledging we've experienced collective trauma. And we think that maybe some of you might benefit from healing, and here's some community resources, or engage your community partners to see what they might be offer, and have the school division be the facilitator of sharing that information. What a great service to your community. Share with them how to access trauma-informed care and mental health resources. Some other things to think about, and this happens a lot in our school systems, is view the response that you all have through the lens of those who are most impacted. So again, with our partnership now with Safe and Sound Schools at the Donovan Group, we have access to individuals who've been in it, been in some of the most truly tragic school incidents in our country. And some things that we have learned in hearing them is that creating memorials for those who've maybe lost life maybe helps us feel good, those who weren't part of the loss of individuals that we really love and care for, but it has a long-term impact on those who have lost. And so it's visual, and a lot of times people will place things like teddy bears or whatever. One person who lost a family member, a child, through one of these, just full of teddy bears with their child's name on it, because they can't get rid of those, but they also can't look at them. And so, it's this thing, these are things that we don't have good perspective on in our roles, and I think it's good to share. Same thing with like reducing the name of a child or a staff member to a t-shirt or a bracelet. The impact that might have for the family member, for that individual. And this notion of hashtag strong. Maybe we can say that, as a way to like empower people and make them feel like we got this after something truly tragic has happened. But again, for those who've lost someone, they don't feel strong. And so that really falls on deaf ears for them. So just some things to think about with our communication efforts. And the last thing I have to share with you all is if you are in a position where you are managing a crisis and using crisis communications that are going to be shared across the country because it's something really big, it's really important to practice self-care. And what is it that you're doing to take care of yourself after something that's pretty traumatic, as well as thinking about those who are closest to you on your team that might also need your help in terms of practicing that self-care.
All right, some other considerations in the after phase. Of course, the standard reunification method, that is probably going to be initialized in the during, but you're going to also carry it into the recovery phase. Important to note here is police own the crime, fire owns the flame, paramedics own the patient, and schools, quote unquote, own the kids. So in an emergency where you have to reunify, you still, schools and divisions still want and need to them with their parent or guardian, and the other first responders are going to expect that and appreciate that. So make sure that all the mechanisms that are in place to do that, they're fully in school and division's control in such an emergency. So again, we want to get back to the business of work in school as quickly as possible. We want to make sure that people have what they need to reunify. So again, we have lots of tools. I'm just going to quickly go through these. I'm not going to expect you to go through it too much in your mind right now, but just essentially look at this and know that there is a process. There is a process, and basically following this 6-step process in reunification, which we have Virginiaized versions of all of this on our website. Again, all of our trainings have this peppered throughout it. So if you host or come to any of our trainings, you're going to get some of this. And so basically it is from step 1 to step 6. The main thing is accountability and safety, et cetera. And so following a process like this is going to make sure that that happens. So one of the key things is when the parent comes and checks in, they have to show ID. There's a 2-part card. And so their children or child is not sitting there for them to see as soon as they walk in. The kids are out of sight, and that does a lot of things. But essentially, when that parent and that student are reunified with the runner who goes and gets the kid after we prove that that parent or guardian needs to pick up that person, then those 2 pieces are stapled back together so that then if another parent comes or someone else comes and says, "Where's my child?" there is a accountability of who that person went home with. And so that is really critical in an emergency because lots of things, again, are going to be happening. So that having this type of process in place is really, really important. So 2 quick things to follow up on this. If there is a student or staff member that's critically injured, if there is an active shooter or active attack event, it's in legislation that DCJS has to be notified. And that up at the top, there's a place on our website, report a critical incident or emergency. But basically what that does is deploy resources to the division or the school. And so that is a really important thing. They want for it to happen within 6 hours of the emergency. And so, that a clause for how to do that does need to be in your crisis plan. So that's something sometimes people miss. So I wanted to point that out. The other thing, these robocalls that go out and say, from the school division, which are awesome. Those systems are awesome. It gets a lot of information out to a lot of people quickly. But if someone is tragically or critically injured, you do not want that set of parents or guardians to get the generic message and show up at a reunification site and they're not going to be reunified with their student or their family member. So a personal phone call to someone who is directly impacted is absolutely critical. So again, that's a summary of all the recovery type of things you need to think about. That's a summary of all the before, during, and after. You're going to get this, so I'm not going to go through it. But basically, the advice from Lori and I is to spend the time before the emergency to think about this, build those relationships, make safety a part of your culture, not just a once-a-year thing. Basically, even a 10-minute safety segment at every principal's meeting is going to help to make that happen, and fully participating in drills. Use the information you already have, which is your school safety audit, which is lots and lots more information besides what's here. But just this information is going to help so much. Look at a full picture of what safety looks like in your division. Optimize the free training. Take full advantage of that. And most importantly, don't go it alone.
Yeah, and speaking to that, not going at it alone, don't forget that one of your services through VAS is that you have 24/7, 365 access to the Donovan Group team. You can see your hotline number there and your email to send in a ticket. If you're dealing with a crisis, please call that number or email us, and our team stands ready to take care of those crisis communications for you so that you can focus on the response.